I want to start out by thanking our sponsors that make our Naturalist Journeys series possible. Our lead sponsor, Hunger Mountain Co-op. And I want to thank Onion River Outdoors. I want to thank GreenVest, Capital Copy, and Union Mutual for making this possible. This is our 25th year of Naturalist Journeys, I believe. And so it's exciting to, although we have to do it virtually this year, we've been able to have a much larger turnout because people can tune in from their armchairs and coffee tables all over the country and world, which has been really fun to see. Let's see, any other points of logistics? If you have any troubles hearing Nathan, or if you have any technological issues, I'll have this talk recorded and it will be up on our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org, in the next couple of days. You can watch the recording anytime you'd like. If you have any other technological questions, you can feel free to send me a private message in the chat as well. So with that, I want to turn it over to Nathan. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us tonight and being here to share your wisdom with us about spring ephemeral and understory ecology.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean, for inviting me, and thank you to the North Branch Nature Center for hosting this webinar series. And thank you to all of you for spending a bit of your time this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're tuning in from, listening to me talk about plants. Definitely a topic that's really important to me and near and dear to my heart. So before we dive into the topic of today's talk, which is slugs, seed dispersers, and stone walls, specifically how they relate to our understory herbaceous plant communities of northeastern forests, I want to do a couple things. I first want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you all today from the homelands of the Ho-Chunk Nation, the nation that is indigenous to this part of what is now known as North America here in Madison, Wisconsin. And I also want to take a moment to just briefly introduce myself and give you some context for where I'm coming from, where I am now, and why I'm here talking to you all about plants. So I grew up spending a lot of time outside in the forests of upstate New York, in the Finger Lakes region, and in the Adirondacks. And from a very young age, absolutely fell in love with spending time outside and the outdoors and the environment. I feel really fortunate that I was later able to turn this passion for the outdoors into a job opportunity. I, a few summers ago, was a summit steward with the Adirondack Mountain Club, where my job every day was to climb to the summits of the highest mountains of New York, take summit selfies with hikers, enjoy the absolutely incredible views up there, but most importantly, protect the rare and fragile alpine vegetation that is found above tree line on a few of these summits. So I would speak to every hiker that would come up, ask them to walk only on solid rock surfaces, because while a lot of these plants above tree line do a really good job at withstanding the really harsh conditions that occur above tree line, they only have roughly 60 frost-free days to grow. A couple of hikers' footsteps could lead very quickly to erosion and death of these individuals. And many of these individuals are rare and endangered too in the state. This plant you see in the middle of your screen here is alpine azalea, and it's found on only one summit in all of New York State. So incredibly rare at the state level. I'm sharing this with you just to give you a sense for a summer that was really important for turning my general love for the outdoors into a more specific love for conservation and protection of whole plant communities. As for my academic background, I am a 2019 graduate of the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York, where I majored in conservation biology with a minor in native peoples and the environment. And pretty quickly after I arrived on campus at ESF, I found plants to be the taxa, the organisms that I was most fascinated by, their ecology and their biology. And so I quickly got involved with plant ecological research, specifically with Dr. Gregory McGee and Jeffrey Griffiths, two folks at ESF who do a lot of work looking at understory plants and their distribution across central New York related to post-agricultural forests. And I'll be touching more on this research later because it directly relates to this topic, but suffice it to say, similar to the Summit Steward opportunity, this was another example of a moment where my general love for the environment and the outdoors honed into, in this case, a more specific love for research, and particularly being able to learn from these understory plants that we find in northeastern forests. This love has expanded. This talk will be biased towards vascular plants, but my passion for plants also includes the non-vascular kind like mosses. And this passion continues today, where if you see me hiking in the woods, you'll often find me prostrate on the ground taking pictures of plants. Now, I am no longer in the Northeast. I am currently a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm in the Ecosystem and Landscape Ecology lab working with Dr. Monica Turner, and my study system has changed. I now go out west every summer instead of to the woods of the Northeast, but what I study hasn't quite changed that much. I'm still interested in whole plant communities, forest communities, and in this case, how they're responding to changing fire and climate regimes. I'll provide a couple of points of contact at the end where you can learn more about this research, but now that you have some background and a sense of where I'm coming from, we can go ahead and get into the topic of today's presentation. So I first want to ask you all to close your eyes. Now, you of course don't actually have to, but my goal here is to make you all co-conspirators of sorts in creating the space that we're going to fill for the next 45 minutes or so. Imagine with me it's spring. It's about 5 months from now. Not long ago did the snowpack finally thaw and brown and gray replace the white that was once along the forest floor. The sun is shining brightly through the trees, and you convince yourself that it's actually kind of warm out today. After some meandering through the maples and the beeches, you finally see what you're looking for: the lovely color of spring's first push, the color of flowering herbaceous plants. Now that you've got your search image back, you start seeing them everywhere. And if you're like me, what excites you most is you're going to continue to see them throughout the rest of the summer. Leaves on the trees will grow, creeks and rivers will rush and fade, but the understory will stay colorful until winter comes again. You can open your eyes now if you decided to close them. These individuals, like the ones that you see on your screen, are our protagonists tonight. And they're important because they make up the majority of temperate forest plant biodiversity. They're everywhere. They're going to be the focus of our story. And like any good protagonist, they deserve for us to follow their whole story, from beginning through the complex and myriad interactions with other organisms, plants and animals, bugs and fungi, all the way to the end. But exactly who are the other organisms that one plant might interact with in its life? Well,
hey Nathan, sorry, let me interrupt you really quickly.
Yeah.
I'm only seeing an icon of what looks like a little spring beauty in the corner, and I'm not sure if you have other stuff going on as well.
That is what's supposed to be happening.
Perfect. Good. Thank you.
Yep.
Carry on.
Yeah, we're going to start at the beginning with just the seed to find out. So different understory plants have their seeds dispersed in a number of different ways. Some don't even need help from other animals to do so, like those who have their seeds dispersed by wind, which is called anemochory. The benefit here is that the plant can produce a lot of little seeds that individually don't have a high chance of establishing, but as a group, it is likely that one of them will find a good place to land and to grow. Many species do this, such as, white wood aster and rattlesnake root. As a brief aside related to my Summit Steward days, there is a rattlesnake root, which you can see pictured here, that white flower in the lower left of this image, that is cousin to the ones that we find in the understory called Boots rattlesnake root, that is found at the high elevations in the alpine zone of New York. In fact, this is the only place where you can find this species in the whole state. And as you can see, not a bad place to have your seeds dispersed by wind. Another seed dispersal mechanism that relies on no one else's help is barochory, or seed dispersal by a pressured release. Starflower and toothwort are two species believed to disperse their seeds in this way. Now, a lot of mosses actually use this technique too, but rather than dispersing seeds, which they don't produce, they're dispersing their spores. Now, the seed dispersal mechanism that many of you are likely most familiar with, and the mechanism that will first be introduced to a lot of other organisms in this whole forest community, is called zoochory, or seed dispersal by animals. This could be birds, like we see here, rodents, deer, or others. Now, a lot of charismatic seed producers of the understory plant community have their seeds dispersed in this way, producing large and often colorful fruits to attract animals. These include white baneberry, with those characteristic doll's eyes for fruit, false Solomon seal, which produces bright red fruits that are dispersed by bird, blue cohosh, mayapple, cucumber root, and wintergreen, just to name a few others. Now, seed dispersal by animal can be really beneficial for plants, particularly if that animal travels far and the plant can establish in a completely new environment. Now, for my personal favorite seed dispersal mechanism, we have myrmecochorous, or seed dispersal by ants. Yes, ants. To attract ants as seed dispersers, the plant has to produce a seed that has this extra part on the outside called an elaiosome that is really rich in the fat and the nutrients that ants can use as a food source. So the seed ripens, the plant drops that seed directly below itself, directly below the parent plant. The ant, attracted to it as a food source, comes in and collects the whole seed with the elaiosome, brings it back to the nest where it's going to eat that elaiosome and discard that seed intact and unharmed in the nest, which is now dispersed away from the parent plant and can germinate. A number of plants have their seeds dispersed in this way, but I want to highlight bloodroots, trilliums, and spring beauty, which also happen to be a few of my favorite understory plants. A fun note too about trillium, specifically white trillium, it's also been shown that they have their seed dispersed by deer who actually eat the seed and then defecate them unharmed and dispersed away from the parent plant. Now, there are other organisms too who interact with these plants at this point in their life stage, but not as seed dispersers, rather as seed predators, disrupting the seed dispersal mutualism and themselves directly benefiting. One of the more prevalent seed disruptors are rodents. Rodent predation of seeds can act as a really strong pressure on plant populations. Not only the regular pressure that we think of by removing those seeds from the population that could otherwise germinate, but a selective pressure too, in an evolutionary sense. One study found that for plants with their seeds that have their seeds dispersed by ants, so using that myrmecochorous mutualism, when ants and rodents were both allowed access to seeds, significantly fewer seeds were preyed on by rodents than when just the rodents were allowed access, indicating myrmecochorous, this seed dispersal mutualism, may have actually evolved as a way for the seeds to escape predation by rodents. Another adaptation to avoid predation by rodents that has been proposed by others is used by certain desert plants who drop their seeds after sunrise and then throughout the day to avoid those rodent predators that are nocturnal and happen to be most active at night. Now, rodents, while common, aren't always present to eat seeds. And in fact, rodents can also act as seed dispersers themselves, often not in this case though. Sometimes the forest habitat isn't right for them to exist there, however, or they have just low population numbers and there isn't a lot of seed predation going on. Regardless, seed predation by rodents is still pretty common for a lot of different species, no matter who or what disperses their seeds. But for those who do have their seeds dispersed by ants, that elaiosome that we talked about, that food source on the outside of the seed, can attract other seed dispersal disruptors as well, like beetles. Ground beetles have been shown to both eat the whole seed as well as just the elaiosome. And when that elaiosome is removed, that seed is no longer of interest to an ant and will likely go undispersed. Finally, I want to highlight another organism that can be attracted to seeds as a food source, slugs. And as it's been found, not just any slugs, but an invasive slug. This is a video of the invasive slug, Arion subfuscus. Don't worry if you can't hear the video, you don't need to hear the sound of the video. Undulating on in to munch on some white trillium seeds, which you see there. The seed is the yellow part and the white part is that elaiosome on the outside. Here we see an ant actually attempting to remove one of these seeds. So pretty cool to see two of these players right next to each other, one disrupting and one acting in this mutualism. And then once the slug has extinguished its food resources here, it's going to roll on out and look for more food. And as you can see, those elaiosomes that were present before the slug was there are completely removed. And now these white trillium seeds are probably going to go completely undispersed. It turns out this may be somewhat of a prevalent phenomena in northeastern forests. And just to reiterate this point, I have a couple of these images to show you just how extensive this can be and the impacts it could have. So on the left, you see seeds of red trillium set out, and that substance around the outside of those seeds is a really sticky resinous-y substance called tanglefoot that I set out in this experiment to originally exclude ants from accessing the seeds. Turns out it did a really good job at keeping slugs away from them too, because as you can see on the image on the left, those elaiosomes are intact. That bright yellow part on the outside of the seed you can still see, while on the right, where there is no tanglefoot to exclude either ants or slugs, the elaiosomes have been removed, and there's this slime trail moving between the seeds, indicating a slug got there. Now, thinking back to our mention of myrmecochorous evolving maybe as this way for seeds or for plants to escape predation by rodents, it's interesting to note that the slug actually got to the seeds before the ants did. And the effects that this is going to have on plant populations is being studied by a lot of researchers in the Northeast and elsewhere. So as you can see, there are a lot of different organisms and a lot of different groups and taxa that are involved with dispersing seeds and inhibiting this dispersal that interact with these understory herbaceous plants. But to continue on with the story, let's follow a seed that actually was successfully dispersed by an ant. So the ant brings it back to its nest, it eats that elaiosome, discards it in the nest where it can now germinate and grow. Now it has been shown that ant nests may actually be suitable nutrient-rich microsites that are particularly well suited for plant seeds to germinate, as you can see marked here by the green on the ground. Other areas may not be as good, whether due to a lack of nutrient availability, too high or too low a pH, too much exposure to seed predators, or some other reason. Suffice it to say, not all bits of soil are created equal, at least not in the eyes of a plant seed. Now, just so we aren't biasing this talk only towards those plants that have their seeds dispersed by ants, I want to mention that birds can be really beneficial for seed germination too. Some plants actually require their seeds be passed through a bird's digestive system before they can germinate, and others simply benefit from the nutrient-rich packet that gets delivered with the seed when the bird defecates. You'll notice here that the soil that was originally relatively unsuitable has now become suitable simply through this interaction with another animal, in this case, a bird. Now, I've already alluded to this, but environmental conditions mediate establishment as well. Some plants only germinate in shady environments, like you can see here, either because of a direct dislike for full sun or because they're simply outcompeted by other plants in the sun. And this can be affected by forest structure. So if a tree falls and dies, an area that was once suitable could become unsuitable. Still others prefer bright, sunny environments like forest gaps or forest edges to germinate and grow, and do not like those shadier environments. Now, of course, light and soil are not necessarily living factors, but they are mediated by living organisms, like trees that can shade out or provide gaps in the forest in the right place at the right time for a plant to germinate. Another non-living or abiotic factor that could influence seed germination is called microtopography, or this small-scale variability in the terrain of the forest floor. Some plants like to be high and dry up on those hummocks, while others prefer to be in those lower, typically more mesic or wetter hollows. But again, this isn't really just the physical environment, but a result of other organisms in the community interacting with it. For example, trees falling over can create what are called tip-up mounds with their roots when they get pulled up from the ground, both exposing soil and creating a wetter depression that can allow plants to grow in the future. And then that tree's decay not only will provide nutrients to that immediate area adjacent to its decay, but also ends up forming one of those higher hummocks that plants in a few decades to centuries can grow on. These indirect interactions are really important and can mean the difference between establishing or perishing for a seed. So now that the seed has germinated, the seedling has become established and the plant grows. To do so, the plant, of course, has to acquire the energy and the nutrients needed to build new tissues. Energy, plants are excellent at obtaining from the sun through photosynthesis and acquiring carbon from carbon dioxide, but nutrients are a different story. They tend to be much harder for plants to get on their own. This is where fungi come in, another organism interacting with these plants at this point of their life stage. Many different plant species form relationships with fungi via their roots, which we can generally call mycorrhizal associations. A more fun term I like to use is being friends with fungi. Generally, we can think of this association as a mutualism where both parties benefit, the plant and the fungus, where the plant receives nutrients like nitrogen from the fungus, while the fungus receives the sugars that the plant produced via photosynthesis. One kind of mycorrhizal association is with a group of fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizae. And in this case, the fungi actually enters individual plant cells in the roots and forms the structure that you see here called an arbuscule. And this is the structure at which, this is the interface where the plant and the fungus are exchanging materials with one another in this mutualism. Many understory herbaceous plants, indeed many plants generally, form this type and other types of relationships with fungi, like wild leek, bloodroots, sharp-lobed hepatica, and trout lily, as I mentioned. Now, through these mycorrhizal associations, spring ephemerals, or those plants that are the first to emerge in the spring, many of whom we've been introduced to already, absorb many important nutrients like nitrogen, but phosphorus can be absorbed too. And they do this in the spring before trees have leafed out to themselves take them up. And in this way, spring ephemerals can keep many important nutrients from leaving forests during spring rains. More recently, however, it's also been shown that these plants do more than just hold on to resources. A recent study that put sugar maple and trout lily together in the same pot showed that carbon that was assimilated by trout lily in the spring before leaf out of the sugar maple was later transferred to the maple via those mycorrhizal associations and those networks connecting them underground, which is just a really cool indirect interaction and part of this mutualism that often goes unnoticed. Now, just as understory species play important roles in mutualisms, they hold other roles as well, primarily as a food source for herbivores, such as deer. Now, if you're like me and you love the understory and love understory plants, then you really just see deer like this. You really just see them as lawnmowers. They've exploded in population size in the last century or so, and this is having really important effects on understory plant communities. For example, American ginseng, which is a plant whose conservation status is vulnerable, is one of these understory species that deer preferentially browse and are having really negative effects on the populations of American ginseng. Now, beyond this obvious destruction of above ground stems that impacts growth and survival of individual plants, deer can also alter whole plant community trajectories, and they do so by not eating certain plants, the ones they find not palatable, which in turn, when certain plants are chosen to be eaten or not, can have cascading effects on other plant and animal species in these communities. Deer are this excellent example of how a native species can actually become invasive. But why did they become invasive? It turns out Deer absolutely love the types of habitat we've created where across the landscape, there's this mix of fields and forest. In addition, we've removed their top predators, like wolves, leading to what's called this trophic downgrade, where basically the food chain is shortened, leading to an explosion of the deer population. So yes, even those wolves can have an indirect effect and interaction with understory plant communities. Non-native or exotic invasive species are having big impacts on forest understories too. One such invasive species is the earthworm, which impacts plant communities through their alteration of soil structure. Now, not all earthworms in the Northeast are exotic and invasive, but those that are having profound effects. To quote a paper that was published on the subject in 2015, earthworm invasions favor bacterial over fungal decomposition and increased decomposition of the forest floor, which can lead to soil compaction, changes to soil structure, alteration of below ground food webs, and nutrient translocation. Indeed, surveys of plant community composition show that earthworm invasions promote grasses, sedges, non-mycorrhizal, and non-native plants at the expense of native herbaceous understory plants. Now, it just so happens that Vermont, as well as Wisconsin, where I'm speaking to you all from, is at the leading edge of a new earthworm invasion by the Asian jumping worm, which you see here. And you can identify this by its snake-like wriggle. So this is an ongoing process that, in some cases, the full effects of invasion have really yet to be felt. This same paper, the paper that was published in 2015, goes on to describe earthworms and deer as two of the most important contemporary stressors to forest plant populations in Eastern North America. That's a really big deal. One native, one non-native, both invasive species in these communities taking part in interactions that will have long-lasting effects on understory plant species. So let's say, though, that a plant species survives the earthworm and the deer. It grows, it stores energy and nutrients, and then the above ground part dies back before winter. The next year, if it escapes earthworms and deer again, it grows, stores more energy and nutrients, and then dies back before winter. This happens for a couple of years before finally, one spring, the plant flowers. At this point, there is now a whole other community of pollinators that are frankly poorly understood that this species just now begins to interact with. A study of Hepatica found numerous species of solitary bees, like these that you see here, as well as beetles carrying this plant's pollen. And another study found 9 species of just bumblebee visiting understory flowers. This flowering and pollination doesn't happen all at once, however. Different plant species are, of course, flowering at different times throughout the season. In the Northeast, it's been shown that there are 2 main peaks in flowering, one in May before the trees leaf out, and then one later in the summer in July. Bees, like the ones you see here, dominate as insect visitors to flowers in June, but flies are more common in early spring and late summer. Now, this may look like a bee, but this is actually a hoverfly, which mimics bees and wasps. And you can tell that it is because it only has 2 wings instead of 4. Also, though it's hard to tell, there is another insect visiting this anise root that to me looks like some sort of true bug or beetle, which isn't surprising because there are a lot of different organisms that can act as pollinators of these plants. Outside of bees and flies, others have found beetles, hummingbirds, wasps, butterflies, and moths visiting understory flowers, and many doing so as pollinators. For example, this plant, red columbine, has been shown to be pollinated by hummingbirds, like this ruby-throated hummingbird. But generally, the complete guild of insect pollinators and visitors to understory herbaceous plant species is somewhat poorly understood. Some species, in fact, don't even require pollination by insects or birds either, where their pollen is either dispersed on the wind or individual plants or inside the same flower too produce both the male and the female parts that are necessary for reproduction and that are compatible with one another. I should say too that pollination and seed production isn't the only way for these plants to grow or expand. Vegetative production is also very common in understory herbaceous plant communities, part of why you see such large clumps of them in the forest like this. Now, whether it's through spreading vegetatively by an underground stem, which is called the rhizome, poor seed dispersal, the location of one of those suitable microsites, maybe a hollow or a hummock, or some combination of these factors, these plants often cluster on the forest floor. So I hope I've made it clear that there is this vast and complex network of organisms, including vertebrates, invertebrates, fungi, and plants that associate with and interact with understory herbaceous plants. In fact, the extent of these interactions continues to be broadened yearly by excited scientists who love flowers. Now, I also hope that you're able to see how big an impact it could make if these plant species were completely missing from our forests. Sadly, this happens to be the case across much of the western United States in forests that were once cleared for agriculture. These lands, since abandoned around the turn of the 20th century, have regenerated back into forest, and we see signs of this past all over in things like old stone walls or wolf trees, which were once those trees that were all alone by themselves out in the middle of a pasture. We see this history in forests consisting of trees that are all about the same size, they're probably about the same age, probably only one of a couple different species. We see this in the simplified microtopography on the forest floor because it was turned over and tilled for agriculture or maybe cleared for pasture land, and of course, old stone walls. We see this history in the Norway spruce plantations that were planted by the Conservation Corps during the Great Depression that are now chock full of hay-scented fern because that's what the deer don't like to eat. And we see this in the colorless understory when we go into these post-agricultural forests each spring and summer. Many of these species that we've discussed today, which are still found in abundance in those forests that were never cleared for agriculture, are strikingly missing from post-agricultural forests. You can see this indicated here. So imagine that the y-axis on the far left of these graphs is an old stone wall separating a post-agricultural forest on the right from one that was never cleared for agriculture on the left. As you move into the post-agricultural forest, moving right, the presence and abundance of understory species drops precipitously within 10 meters or 30 feet of that old stone wall. And these are forests that in some cases have been regenerating for upwards of a century, 100 years. It's also important to note that post-agricultural forests are widespread across the landscape. For example, over half of the 7.5 million hectares of forest in New York is post-agricultural forest. But why is this the case? How could differences be so sharply marked by an old stone wall? This is an area of continued research, but I'd like to share some of the hypotheses for why many understory species may still be failing to reestablish in post-agricultural forests. Remember back to our discussion about abiotic conditions such as light levels and microtopography that can benefit or hinder germination, establishment, and growth of understory plants. Take this forest, which is old and was never cleared for agriculture. Since the trees are older, there is an increased likelihood that one or more will die, fall, and open up the canopy to abundant light to reach the forest floor. This can be really beneficial for some understory plant species. But in post-agricultural forests, the trees are all about the same age, they tend to be about the same size, and they're really not old enough yet to create those gaps in the forest that can be beneficial for understory plants. And this has been shown to directly impact understory plants. A study that was done in 2010 found that two summer flowering plants had fewer flowers and a lower flowering frequency in those areas that were shadier compared to areas that were considerably sunnier. Now, these forest gaps, or the lack thereof, in post-agricultural forests have implications for the associated pollinators as well. A study that was conducted in Ontario, Canada, found pollinators to be more active in forest gaps, and understory plants were more likely to be pollinated in them as well. Interestingly, the picture, as it tends to be in ecology, is more complicated than this. Many forests, like post-agricultural forests that were subjected to human disturbance, have old logging roads or old farm lanes running through them. And the same positive effect on pollination that forest gaps have also has been shown to occur in these old logging roads. So the picture, as it tends to be, is a little bit muddier than just cut and dry. Now, other resources besides light may also be limiting in post-agricultural forests. Nitrogen, which is an important plant nutrient, is well known as a limiting nutrient in many ecosystems, including forests. Some have shown, however, that it may be even more limiting, meaning that there's even less of it in some post-agricultural forests. A 2009 study that was done in North Carolina found nitrogen fertilization increased the above ground biomass, which is basically how much of the plant is above the soil surface, of 2 understory plants more so in post-agricultural than in uncleared forests, indicating nitrogen was more limiting to growth in the post-agricultural forests studied. Now, this study was done in the southeast, but our northeastern woods too have experienced shifts in the soil microbial community of post-agricultural forests that affects nutrient availability to understory plants, nutrients like nitrogen. Now, while this reduced habitat quality in post-agricultural forests has been shown to limit understory plant reestablishment, this can only occur, of course, after the seed gets there. And limited seed dispersal into post-agricultural forests is believed to be a much larger contributing factor to why these species are still missing. For this, let's turn back to talking about ants. Think about how far an ant could carry a seed. Possibly pretty far, but would the ant frequently do so? No. You can see this represented here by this global dispersal curve, where most seeds that are dispersed by ants are dispersed less than 5 meters away from the parent plant. And this is because the ant is foraging for food within a certain small distance around its nest. And once that food is found, it's usually brought right back to the nest. So long distance dispersal events for plants that have their seeds dispersed by ants is very unlikely. Let's put this into context. Post-agricultural forests are separated from uncleared forests where these seeds need to come from. In some cases, they aren't separated by much or are in fact right next to each other like we saw. But in other cases, post-agricultural and uncleared forests could be separated by miles, with the in-between consisting of roads, farm fields, or other forms of human development. Is this happy habitat for an ant to bring a seed through? Not really. We can apply this idea to all plants, no matter who or what disperses their seeds. The further 2 locations are from one another, the smaller those locations are, and the more inhospitable the areas in between them are, the harder it gets for a seed to travel between them. Given how much we've dissected our landscape, separating often small plots of forest from one another in this surrounding milieu of human development, dispersal into post-agricultural forests functionally drops to 0. So I hope we can all agree that first and foremost, the existence and bringing these species back to post-agricultural forests is important, firstly for their own sake. But in light of our discussion tonight, I think the impact of their impoverishment in post-agricultural forests may actually best be summed up by a quote from Daniel Jansen in his paper published in 1974 titled "The Deflowering of Central America." In discussing species extinctions, Jansen states, "What escapes the eye is a much more insidious kind of extinction, the extinction of ecological interactions. The extent to which past land use impacts present-day forest communities has been and continues to be an area of intense research. New information is uncovered every year, but I hope that I've made it clear tonight that when we don't have an abundance and diversity of understory flora in our forests, many ecological interactions themselves are completely lost. But there is hope. I don't want to leave you on such a sad note. There are many forests, as y'all are aware, that were never cleared for agriculture and have actually maintained robust populations of understory plants. And others, too, are working to understand how to restore degraded post-agricultural forests. A recent study found that wild ginger and waterleaf were actually successful in establishing in post-agricultural forests when they were physically planted there. And another study that was done in post-agricultural forests in Iowa, closer to me, found 57% of transplanted individuals across 24 different species persisted 7 years after planting, and many of them flowered too. However, as always, there are caveats, namely our friend or nemesis, the lawnmower, and more accurately, the lawnmower and all of its friends. A study that was conducted in 2003 brought 9 species of understory plants into forests, and they put them both inside deer exclosures where the deer couldn't get them, as well as planted them outside deer exclosures where the deer actually had access. Inside those exclosures, plant establishment and survival was 46% after 3 years, but this is compared to only 23% outside of deer exclosures. In addition, the researchers found that pollination of 5 of these species and ant seed dispersal of 1 of them only occurred within the deer exclosures and never outside of them. Now, while there is research going on, many of you can also take part in understanding where these plants are and how we can get them back to post-agricultural forests. Applications on your phone, such as iNaturalist, are easy to use and a great way to document both plant locations as well as the timing of different stages like emergence or flowering, which are important for researchers to understand how that could be changing with climate change. Now, I also want to share my small part of this story as it relates to the reestablishment of understory plants in post-agricultural forests, specifically those plants that have their seeds dispersed by ants. Probably comes as no surprise. This is a photo of a younger version of me back in the summer of 2017, undertaking my very first research project. Now, there were a couple of components to this work, but part of my research focused on whether or not ants capable of seed dispersal were actually even present in post-agricultural forests. If they were, then we could expect that planting trials, bringing the plants back, may be successful at reestablishing this mutualism in degraded forests. If these ants weren't present, then we'd expect that this missing mutualistic partnership could be just yet another hurdle to overcome during restoration. To answer this question, I set out seeds of 3 ant-dispersed plants, Spring Beauty, Bloodroot, and Red Trillium, in both uncleared and post-agricultural forests, and then experimentally manipulated both ant as the seed disperser and rodent as the seed predator access to assess the levels of seed predation and seed dispersal in these forests. To exclude rodents, I used the metal cages that you see here dug into the ground, and to exclude ants from the seeds, and as we saw earlier, it does a good job excluding slugs as well, I used tanglefoot, that sticky substance. Now, I also used tuna, which is rich in many of the fats and the nutrients present in the elaiosome of ant-dispersed seeds, as a bait to attract and to capture ants in both of these forests that could later be identified to species. What we found was, to me, really exciting. Not only were ants capable of dispersing seeds present in post-agricultural forests, ants like Aphanigaster rudis, but we also found high rates of seed removal in both uncleared, or in this graph, residual, and post-agricultural forests, with no difference in the proportion of seeds removed between the two. Furthermore, rodent predation was practically non-existent at our sites, so the high rates of removal, combined with the presence of seed dispersers in the form of these ants, allowed us to conclude that seed dispersal by ants did not differ between uncleared and post-agricultural forests. And what this means to me is that if we are successfully able to transplant individuals of these species, these plants, back into post-agricultural forests, and they overcome the other establishment limitations mentioned earlier, the parts should be in place for this mutualism to reestablish itself in degraded forests. So despite the obvious challenges, there is much to be gained by reestablishing understory communities in these forests. Not only will we be privileged by their bright blooms each spring, but as we've learned, numerous other organisms, big and small, will benefit from their presence as well. I want to thank you all again for being here today and just provide a couple of points of contact for me before I open it up to questions. My email is there on the screen, nkiel@wisc.edu. You can learn more about my current research out in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem at landscape.zoology.wisc.edu. My personal website is nathankiel.com. And for those of you on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter at evenkiel25. And I'd like to now open it up to any questions.
Nathan, thank you so much. That was fantastic. While we wait for a couple of questions to come into the chat bar, I just wanted to throw in my own that I was wondering. I'm wondering if there's any research looking at the relationship between the earthworms and ants. In particular, I was wondering about effects they might have on things like soil compaction and things like that, making if earthworms make life more difficult for those ants and change their microhabitats.
Yeah, Sean, I suspect that there is. I wouldn't be able to point you to any of those resources, but yeah, I suspect people are definitely looking into that because it is such a pervasive phenomenon and having really big impacts on our forests.
Liz is asking, does the type of past agriculture matter? Is it pasture, pasture land, hayfields, croplands, and does soil type matter?
That's a good question. I think that it does depend to some extent, but I think that the past land use, and especially if you're limiting it to those that you mentioned, so pasture land, agriculture, I think the differences there are not going to be enough to 100 years later have as big an impact on just generally clearing a forest, basically extirpating everything from the soil, the seed bank is completely removed, and then letting it regenerate naturally. So between those two mentioned, I don't think, or those ones mentioned, I don't think there's a huge impact, but maybe compared to something like logging, there could be other impacts that are different. Oh, you're muted, Sean.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alan's wondering if you know of good seed sources for missing plants, if there's nurseries that are actively, cultivating trillium seeds and the like.
You all would know better than me in your local area. I definitely would recommend you reach out. I can't say that I support like people just going into the woods and throwing seeds everywhere. I think it should be a part of some sort of established reestablishment routine. But yeah, I'm sure there are local nurseries in the Northeast that have these plants that you could plant in your own backyard. And I would definitely recommend them. As you saw, there's a lot of native organisms that could really benefit from their presence.
Yeah, if anybody out there knows of any nurseries in our area that you've seen carrying some of these, spring ephemeral, especially ant-mediated plants, I'd be curious to know for you to throw in the chat bar. Kate's wondering if all slug species are invasive.
I don't believe so. No. Yeah, no, they're not. But the ones that, yeah, we're seeing big impacts in my study, as well as another study that was done in Canada in 2016, found really big impacts of this invasive slug called Arion subfuscus. I think the common name is dusky arion, A-R-I-O-N. That's having a particularly big impact in the form of this eliasome robbery or removal.
Let's see, a lot of questions, which is great, hard to keep up with. Let's see, Diana's asking, what about the fungi friends in post-agricultural landscapes? Is there any difference there?
There is, yeah, especially in the Northeast. So I mentioned the study that was done in the Southeast where nitrogen is limiting, and in a lot of places in New England, nitrogen is actually, our soils are actually saturated with nitrogen. It's not as limiting of a resource as you find in other places like the Southeast. But the plant's access to those nutrients is still being affected by changes to those microbial communities. So that would include the fungi. So yeah, that friends with fungi mutualism is being affected as well. Those organisms can be missing in post-agricultural forests.
James is wondering if the primary agents of dispersal for understory plants differs in between different primary successional forests. So for instance, post-glacial environments versus post-volcanic environments and other types of square ones.
Yeah, so is that different different types of early successional or through different points along succession?
I think different types of early successional forests. Yeah.
I wouldn't know, but I would suspect that what would be advantageous for what is advantageous for early successional plants is getting there first. And so often they'll be seed dispersed rather than animal dispersed. Though I could also see, well, no, animal dispersal would probably come in later because what you want is an early successional environment that's actually developed some structure that would attract animals first. And then indirectly, because of that attraction, some of those animals that, or some of those seeds, those plants that have their seeds dispersed by animals would show up a little bit later. So I would think wind for most early successional environments.
Karen's wondering, does the keystone species theory fit into your narrative here?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard, I can't think of people calling them per se keystone species, and they are somewhat abundant. So yeah, for a keystone species, or for something to be called a keystone species, it should be, its impact on the community should be disproportionately large compared to its abundance in the community. And so I'm not exactly sure that that would apply to understory plants, at least you know, in the state that we want them in, where they are really abundant. I think it's more that they're a really integral part that, like anything that can be lost, has ripple effects in these really intricate webs of communities.
A couple of great comments from folks sharing some information about seed sources and plant sources. So Polly's saying the New England Wildflower Society, now known as Native Plant Trust in Massachusetts, sells plants and recommends plants for establishing rather than seeds because they're more reliable, especially as so much research is needed into the germination of these plants. And then also Kathy is mentioning that United Plant Savers used to have a nursery and sell plants for this. And I believe United Plant Savers is in Michigan. Someone else might be able to remember better than me. And then the maybe Vermont, Eve's saying maybe a Vermont Wildflower Farm. Let's see. Oh, for those of you that are right here in Montpelier, Erin O'Hara at Turtle Hill Natives on North Street in Montpelier. Try her for native plants.
Crowdsourcing our native plants.
Arcana Nursery in Jericho. This is great. Let's see. Terry's saying American Meadows. Liz is suggesting that maybe deer are a keystone species in this environment.
Yeah, I don't know about that. That's a really good thought. And I guess what I would say is that deer are having this huge impact because of their abundance and because keystone species is related to an organism that is in a lower abundance compared to its impact. I still probably wouldn't refer to deer as a keystone species just because their impact is through their abundance, through their sheer abundance.
And I was wondering too, so it seems like there's this, the relationship between a lot of these ant dispersed herbaceous plants and the ants is kind of one way in that the plants are entirely dependent. They have a specialized relationship with the ants, but not necessarily the other way around. The ants are not specialists in these aliosomes, as evidenced by the fact that they're in these environments. You found them in these environments even in the absence of these plant communities.
Right.
Comment on
that? Yeah, and a comment on that, Sean, is it's other studies too have shown that the eliasome can actually benefit ant colonies too. It can increase the, I forget exactly what they found, but something through the reproductive effort and output of ant colonies was improved when fed eliasomes compared to other food items. But still, as you said, it's definitely more of a one-way dependence where they can both benefit. And in some cases, other recent studies have even called it a parasitism. But it is pretty context dependent.
If anyone else has any questions, this would be a great time to put it in the chat bar. While we're waiting for that, I wanted to do two things. I wanted to remind folks that next week we have a great presentation coming up as well by Mariah Dunleavy, who has done some fascinating work looking at plant poaching and plant gathering in Shenandoah and in the Great Smoky Mountains. So if you're interested in continuing to think about leafy herbaceous plants and their role in your life in late November in the Northeast, then join us next week. That's at 7 o'clock. So please do join us for that. And then also I want to thank our sponsors again. Thanks to our lead sponsor, Hunger Mountain Co-op. Thanks to Onion River Outdoor, Union Mutual, GreenVest, and Capital Copy for making this possible. Polly's asking, will this presentation be posted for public access? Yes, absolutely. In a couple days, when I can get around to this, I'll have this up on our website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations, where you can go to check out all of our presentations here with North Branch Nature Center. And Liz is asking, can you share a list of the literature that you mentioned?
Yeah, so I messaged her and I got her email, but Sean, I can always, if there's a way that I can share it with you and you can share it with all the participants, I'd be definitely happy to do that.
That would be great. Yeah, I can, underneath the presentation frame on our website, I can put in other things like your email address and links to resources and whatnot. So any kind of appendix materials, I'd be happy to put up there, so you can look there for additional resources. All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Nathan, again, thank you so much for joining us from Wisconsin, and hope you have a great rest of your evening and rest of your week, everybody, and be well.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And thank you everyone for coming.